The Watcher, H-O-U-Z, my dearest new neighbor. Allow me to welcome you to 657 Boulevard. I have been watching this house for decades, and now that you have brought your young blood to fill its rooms, I am overflow with joy. Who am I? I am the Watcher. I have been put in charge of watching and waiting for its second coming. My grandfather watched the house in the 1920s, and my father watched in the 1960s. It is now my time. I pass it on to you now. 657 Boulevard is anxious for you to fill it with the young blood it craves. Have you found what the house needs yet? Have your young ones found what is in the walls yet? That letter arrived at 657 Boulevard in Westfield, New Jersey, in June 2014. It was addressed to Derek and Maria Broaddus. They had owned the house for exactly 1 week. They had not yet moved in. Derek Broaddus was a financial professional in his early 40s. His wife Maria was a former teacher. Together, they had 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter, and for years they had been saving, planning, and searching for the house that would become the center of their family's life. The house where their children would grow up. The house they would grow old in. The house that would mean they had made it. 657 Boulevard was that house. It sat on a quiet, tree-lined street in Westfield, a prosperous suburb of northern New Jersey, 45 minutes from Manhattan. A 6-bedroom colonial-style home built in 1905, with original detailing, high ceilings, and the kind of bones that people who know about houses immediately recognize as something special. It had a wraparound porch. It had a large garden. It had everything. The Broaddus family paid $1.3 million for it in June 2014. It was the most significant purchase of their lives, and they made it with the confidence of people who had done everything right. They had the survey, they had the inspection, they had the financing, they had the keys 6 days after closing. Before a single piece of furniture had been moved in, Derek Broaddus drove to the house alone to check on some renovation work. There was an envelope in the mailbox. He opened it standing in the driveway of his new home in the quiet afternoon of a New Jersey suburb, and began to read. By the time he finished, he was standing, very still. He read it again. Then he called his wife. The letter was handwritten, several pages. It introduced itself as being from someone called the Watcher, and it explained that the writer's family had been watching 657 Boulevard for generations. Grandfather in the 1920s, father in the 1960s, and now the writer themselves, passing the responsibility on. It described the house as waiting, hungry, craving young blood to fill its rooms. It asked whether the Broaddus family had found what the house needed yet. It asked whether their children had found what was in the walls. Derek Broaddus contacted the police the same day. The previous owners of the house, John and Andrea Woods, who had lived there happily for 23 years, were contacted by investigators. They revealed that they too had received a letter from someone calling themselves the Watcher shortly before their sale completed. Their letter had been unsettling, but less explicit than the one sent to the Broaddus family. They had not disclosed it during the sale. They had told themselves it was nothing, a crank, someone with too much time and a strange sense of humor. They had not told the Broaddus family. Derek and Maria made the decision that most people in their position would have made. They contacted the police, gave them the letter, and tried to proceed with their renovation plans while the investigation was underway. They told themselves it was probably nothing, a crank, someone with too much time and a strange sense of humor. Then the second letter arrived. The second letter from the Watcher arrived several weeks after the first. It was longer, it was more specific, and it was significantly more disturbing. Where the first letter had been strange and unsettling, the second was something else. The Watcher wrote about watching the Broaddus family as they visited the house during the renovation period. It described seeing them arrive and leave. It described the children specifically, their ages, their appearance, the way they moved around. The property, it told the Broaddus family that 657 Boulevard had been waiting for the right family to fill it, and that it believed they were that family, but that the house needed things from them in return. It asked again about the walls, whether they had looked inside them, whether they understood yet what the house required. The letter ended with a line that Maria Broaddus would later describe in court documents as the moment everything changed for her. The Watcher wrote that it could see the house from where it was, that it watched every day, that it was patient, that it had been patient for decades and would continue to be patient for as long as necessary. The Broaddus family stopped bringing their children to the house. The police investigation had been running since the first letter, but was producing no results. Handwriting analysis was conducted. The letters were examined for fingerprints and DNA. Investigators canvassed the neighborhood, speaking to residents, trying to establish whether anyone had seen someone unusual near the property or had any knowledge of who the watcher might be. Nobody knew anything, or nobody was sane. Westfield was a town of approximately 30,000 people. It was affluent, quiet, and deeply invested in its own reputation as a safe and desirable place to live. The idea that one of its residents might be sending threatening letters to a family who had just paid $1.3 million for a house on one of its most prestigious streets was not something the community was eager to engage with. The Broaddus family hired a private investigator. They installed security cameras around the property. They began the renovation work with contractors who were briefed on the situation and asked to report anything unusual. They tried, with diminishing success, to continue treating 657 Boulevard as their future home rather than as something that had turned against them before they had even moved in. Then the third letter arrived. The third letter from the watcher was the shortest of the three and the most explicit. It acknowledged that the Broaddus family had contacted the police. It told them this was unnecessary and unwelcome. It told them that 657 Boulevard did not want the police involved in its business. It described the house as a living thing with needs and appetites that the Broaddus family were failing to meet. And it returned with an insistence that investigators found deeply significant to the subject of the children. The watcher wrote that it needed to know how many young ones the Broaddus family had brought to fill the house. It referred to the children using language that every law enforcement professional who read the letter flagged immediately as threatening. It said the house had been waiting for young blood for a long time. It said it was still waiting. Derek and Maria Broaddus made a decision. Their children would never set foot inside 657 Boulevard. Whatever happened with the house, whether they sold it, renovated it, demolished it, or simply walked away from $1.3 million, their children were done with it. The dream was over. What followed was not simply a family walking away from a bad investment. What followed was one of the most protracted, expensive, and ultimately unresolved legal and personal battles in the history of American real estate. The Broaddus family sued the previous owners, John and Andrea Woods, for failing to disclose the letter they had received before the sale. The case went to court. The Woods argued that a single strange letter received shortly before closing did not constitute a material defect requiring disclosure. The court ultimately sided with the Woods. The Broaddus family received nothing. They attempted to sell 657 Boulevard. The story had by this point become public. The letters had been leaked, the case had attracted press attention, and 657 Boulevard was now one of the most famous addresses in New Jersey for entirely the wrong reasons. Potential buyers made offers and withdrew them. The stigma of the house was proving impossible to overcome in a market where buyers could simply choose a different property without a watcher attached to it. They applied to the local council for permission to demolish the house and subdivide the land into 2 lots, which they could then sell separately. The application was rejected by neighbors who did not want the character of the street. Affected by new construction, they proposed converting the house into apartments. That application was also rejected. 657 Boulevard sat empty, unsold, unmoved into, gathering legal fees and mortgage payments and property taxes. While the Broaddus family continued paying for a home their children had been told they could never live in. The question that drove every investigator, every journalist, and eventually a global television audience to obsession was the same question that police had been unable to answer from the beginning. Who was the watcher? The investigation had produced suspects. It had produced theories. It had produced accusations that tore at the fabric of the Westfield community and left lasting damage to relationships between neighbors who had previously been friendly. What it had not produced was an arrest, a charge, or a conviction. The primary suspect who emerged early in the investigation was a man named Michael Langford. He lived on Boulevard, close to number 657. He was known in the neighborhood as someone who paid close attention to the street and the properties on it. He was in his 60s, had lived in the area for years, and fit certain elements of the profile that investigators had developed based on the letters. Someone with a long history in the neighborhood, someone who knew the street well, someone old enough to have a grandfather who might genuinely have watched the house in the 1920s. Langford denied any involvement. He was never charged. The evidence against him was circumstantial, and prosecutors declined to move forward with the case. His family issued statements defending him. The Westfield community was divided. Some residents believed he was responsible. Others were convinced he was an innocent man whose life had been damaged by suspicion and rumor. The investigation continued. Other theories were explored. Some investigators focused on the letters themselves, the language, the references, the specific details that suggested someone with genuine knowledge of the house's history. The mention of the 1920s and the 1960s was either fabricated for effect or indicated someone with a real family connection to the area stretching back generations. Some researchers who studied the case noted that the letters, while deeply disturbing in their content, were also oddly literary. The language was deliberate and careful. The pacing was controlled. Whoever wrote them had thought about them. This was not the work of someone in a state of agitation or instability. This was someone who had decided what they wanted to say, and said it precisely. That observation pointed away from the profile of a random, obsessive, and towards something more considered and deliberate, which made it more frightening rather than less. The theory that gained the most traction in online communities and among independent researchers was that the letters had been written by someone with a specific grievance against the Broaddus family or against the sale of the house. Perhaps a neighbor who had wanted to buy the property themselves. Perhaps someone connected to a previous owner. Perhaps someone who had a personal or financial reason to want the house to remain empty or to be returned to the market at a lower price. This theory had the advantage of explaining the timing. The letters began immediately after the sale, completed, suggesting the writer knew about the transaction and had been waiting for it. It also explained the persistence, 3 letters over several months, suggested someone with a sustained motivation rather than a passing obsession. It explained almost everything except the content of the letters themselves, because if this was a rational actor with a specific grievance and a strategic goal, why write letters about young blood and walls that craved in a family duty stretching back to the 1920s? Why not simply make a legal challenge or an offer to purchase? Unless the content was deliberate misdirection. Unless whoever wrote the letters understood exactly what language would cause maximum fear and disruption, and used it with full awareness of its effect. That possibility, that the watcher was not a genuine obsessive, but a calculated strategist, using the language of obsession as a weapon, is perhaps the most disturbing interpretation of the case. It suggests not madness, but intelligence. Not compulsion, but choice. In 2018, 4 years after the first letter arrived, the story of 657 Boulevard reached a global audience. The New Yorker published a long-form account of the Broaddus family's ordeal that became one of the most read articles in the magazine's recent history. It introduced the case to millions of people who had never heard of Westfield, New Jersey, and generated a level of public interest that transformed a local mystery into an international one. Netflix acquired the rights to the story and developed. Produced by Ryan Murphy and released in 2022, the series fictionalized significant elements of the case and took creative liberties that the Broaddus family publicly objected to. But it brought the story to an audience of tens of millions across the world and permanently embedded 657 Boulevard in popular culture. The Broaddus family had by this point sold the house. In 2019, after years of failed attempts to sell, convert, or demolish the property, they finally found a buyer. The sale price was significantly below what they had paid in 2014. The financial loss, combined with years of legal fees, private investigation costs, and mortgage payments on a house they had never lived in, had been devastating. They moved on. They rebuilt. They declined most interview requests and tried, with understandable difficulty, to put 657 Boulevard behind them. The watcher was never identified. The case remains officially unsolved. No arrest was ever made. No charge was ever filed. The letters sit in an evidence file somewhere in a New Jersey police department. The handwriting analyzed, the paper and ink tested and retested. The words read and reread by investigators who have never been able to attach them to a name. Michael Langford, the primary suspect, continued to live on Boulevard. He maintained his innocence until his death. Whether he was the watcher or an innocent man destroyed by proximity and suspicion is a question the evidence cannot answer. 657 Boulevard still stands. It has been renovated by its current owners. It sits on its quiet, tree-lined street, looking exactly like what it always appeared to be. A beautiful 6-bedroom colonial house in a prosperous New Jersey suburb, the kind of house that people spend their lives working toward. From the outside, it looks completely normal, but somewhere, in a file in a police department, in the memory of a family that paid $1.3 million for a dream that became something else entirely. They're still patient, still watching, and the house at 657 Boulevard. The letters themselves became the most studied and most debated documents in the entire case. 3 pieces of handwritten correspondence that between them contained enough disturbing content to drive a family from a $1.3 million home. Generate years of police investigation, inspire a major Netflix production, and leave an entire community permanently altered in ways that residents of Westfield are still reluctant to discuss openly a decade later. What made the letters so difficult, Tafigir, and so difficult to prosecute, was that they occupied a strange legal gray area. They were threatening in tone and deeply disturbing in content, but they did not contain explicit threats of violence in the specific language that criminal statutes typically require for a harassment or stalking charge to stick. The watcher never said, "I will hurt you," or "I will hurt your children." It said the house craved young blood. It said the walls were waiting. It said it was watching and would continue to watch. These were statements that any reasonable person reading them would interpret as threatening. But reasonable interpretation and legal sufficiency are different standards, and the letters consistently fell just short of the threshold prosecutors needed to move forward with a criminal case. This legal technicality frustrated the family, their attorneys, and the investigators working the case in ways that are difficult to overstate. They had 3 letters. They had a family in genuine fear. They had a house that had been rendered uninhabitable, not by any physical defect, but by the psychological weight of knowing that someone was watching it and had decided to make that watching known. And they could not get a prosecution because the language of the letters was calibrated precisely enough to avoid the specific triggers that would have allowed law enforcement to act decisively. Whether that calibration was deliberate is one of the most chilling questions the case raises. If whoever wrote those letters understood the legal threshold well enough to stay just below it while still causing maximum psychological damage, the watcher had thought about consequences and planned accordingly. The watcher had written letters designed to terrify without providing sufficient legal grounds for prosecution, which suggests a level of premeditation and legal awareness that goes far beyond what most people imagine when they think of someone who sends anonymous threatening mail. The handwriting analysis conducted on the letters produced results that were inconclusive in the most frustrating possible way. The handwriting was consistent across all 3 letters, confirming they were written by the same person. Beyond that, the analysts could say relatively little with certainty. The writing was deliberate and controlled rather than hurried or agitated, which was consistent with the overall tone of the letters. There were no distinctive features that pointed unambiguously to any specific individual whose handwriting could be compared. The paper and ink were common and untraceable. Whoever had written the letters had either known how to avoid leaving forensic evidence or had been lucky enough not to leave any. The DNA testing was similarly frustrating. Trace evidence was found on the envelopes, but it was insufficient for a definitive identification. It could tell investigators that a specific individual had not written the letters, but it could not tell them who had. The investigation accumulated an enormous amount of information that ruled things out without ruling anything definitively in, which is perhaps the most maddening position for any investigative team to occupy. Meanwhile, the family continued to pay for a house they could not use, could not sell, and could not escape. The mortgage payments continued. The property taxes continued. The legal fees from the lawsuit against the previous owners continued. The cost of the private investigator continued. the cost of the security cameras and the security consultants, and the attorneys who were simultaneously pursuing the Woods lawsuit, fighting the neighborhood objections to their demolition application, and responding to media inquiries continued. The financial hemorrhage was significant and sustained and showed no sign of stopping. Derek, who had by any measure done everything right in his life and his career to put his family in a position to buy a $1.3 million home in one of New Jersey's most prestigious suburbs, found himself in a situation that no amount of professional success or careful planning could have prepared him for or protected him against. He had followed every rule. He had done every piece of due diligence. He had built the kind of stable, prosperous life that is supposed to insulate a family from exactly this kind of catastrophe. Because the thing that had destroyed his family's dream was not a market crash or a structural defect or a title dispute. It was a person with a pen and an envelope and a decision to make someone else's life miserable. The psychological impact on the family extended well beyond the financial. Described in later interviews and court documents the specific texture of the fear that the letters produced. The knowledge that someone was watching, the inability to identify who that someone was, for reasons that the family could not understand and had done nothing to invite. The feeling of being seen by something that had chosen not to reveal itself, that was content to watch from a distance and let the watching itself be the weapon. She described being unable to drive past the house without scanning the street for. She described the way the letters had changed her relationship with ordinary suburban spaces, streets, pavements, parked cars, neighbors standing in their gardens, transforming them from the neutral background of daily life into potential vantage points for someone who had decided to make watching her family their purpose. The watching, for all the family knew, never stopped. Their children, who had been told simply that there were problems with the new house and that they would not be moving in, carried their own version of that fear without fully understanding its source. Children are extraordinarily sensitive to the emotional states of their parents, and the children grew up in a household that had been permanently altered by something they were deliberately shielded from knowing the full details of. The long-term psychological cost of that, of growing up in the shadow of something your parents were too frightened to fully explain, is impossible to quantify, but easy to imagine. The community of Westfield carried its own damage from the case. The suspicion that had attached to Michael Langford, never charged, never convicted, maintaining his innocence until his death, created a fracture in a neighborhood that had previously been characterized by exactly the kind of quiet, prosperous normalcy that makes suburbs like Westfield desirable in the first place. Neighbors who had been friendly became guarded. People who had walked past each other on Boulevard for years began to look at each other differently. The knowledge that one of them might be capable of what the watcher had done, or the knowledge that one of them had been falsely suspected of it, was not the kind of knowledge that a community could simply absorb and move on from. Westfield itself became associated with the case in ways that its residents found deeply uncomfortable. The town had always traded on its reputation as one of the safest, most desirable places to live in northern New Jersey. The Watcher case complicated that reputation in ways that local officials, real estate agents, and community organizations spent years trying to manage. The publication of the New Yorker article in 2018 and the Netflix series in 2022 ensured that the association was not temporary. Westfield and the Watcher were now linked in the public imagination in a way that no amount of community relations work could fully undo. 657 Boulevard became a destination. People drove past it. People stopped and took photographs. People knocked on the door of its new owners, who had bought the house, knowing its history, and who found the ongoing public interest in their home somewhere between understandable and deeply intrusive. The house had become something that houses are not supposed to become: a landmark, a curiosity, an object of public fascination, and its current occupants lived with that reality every day in a way that the Broaddus family, for all their suffering, ultimately did not have to once. They sold it and moved away. The Netflix series that brought the case to a global audience in October 2022 was in many ways the final chapter of the Broaddus family's public ordeal. Though not in the way they might have hoped. Ryan Murphy, one of the most successful producers, in American television, acquired the rights to the New Yorker article and developed it into a 7-episode limited series, starring Naomi Watts and Bobby Cannavale as fictionalized versions of the Broaddus family. The series took the documented facts of the case as its starting point and then departed from them significantly, adding fictional plot elements, invented characters, and dramatic developments that had no basis in the actual events at 657 Boulevard. The Broaddus family watched the series and were not pleased in interviews and public statements. They objected to specific elements of the fictionalization that they felt misrepresented them, their decisions, and their characters in ways that caused them additional distress on top of everything they had already endured. They had lived through a nightmare. They had survived it, rebuilt their lives, and tried to move forward. And then a major streaming platform had taken their nightmare, added fictional elements they found objectionable, and broadcast it to tens of millions of people around the world under circumstances where most viewers would not clearly distinguish between what had actually happened and what had been invented for. Dramatic effect, the tension between the Broaddus family's experience and the Netflix dramatization of it raises questions that go beyond this specific case. True crime and real event drama as a genre has always occupied uncomfortable ethical territory. The people whose real suffering provides the raw material for entertainment products rarely have meaningful control over how their stories are told, how they are portrayed, or how their most painful experiences are packaged and sold to a global audience. The Broaddus family had sold the rights to their story, which gave them some financial compensation but did not give them creative control. The result was a version of their lives that they recognized in its broad outlines and rejected in its specific details, broadcast at a scale that dwarfed anything the original press coverage had achieved. For investigators and researchers who had followed the case closely since 2014, the Netflix series had a complicated effect on public understanding of what had actually happened. The dramatization was compelling television, but it was not accurate journalism, and the millions of viewers who watched it came away with an understanding of the case that was shaped as much by dramatic necessity as by documented fact. Details were changed, timelines were compressed, characters were invented. The actual letters, which were disturbing enough in reality, were supplemented with fictional elements that made for better television but muddied the public record of what the watcher had actually written and what it had actually meant. The one thing the Netflix series unambiguously did was generate an enormous wave of renewed interest in the real case. Search traffic for terms related to the watcher, 657 Boulevard, and Westfield, New Jersey spiked dramatically in the weeks following the series' release. Journalists revisited the case. Podcasters covered it. YouTube channels produced documentary-style videos examining the facts. The online true crime community dissected every available piece of evidence with the particular intensity that cold cases attract when a major media production brings them back into public consciousness. None of this renewed attention solved the case. None of the amateur investigators who pored over the letters, the suspect profiles, and the neighborhood history produced evidence that law enforcement did not already have. The watcher remained unidentified. The case remained open. The letters remained in their evidence file, their author unknown, their purpose achieved, and then some. Michael Langford died without ever being charged. Whether he was the watcher or an innocent man who spent the last years of his life under a cloud of public suspicion is a question that his death has made permanently unanswerable. If he was guilty, the secret died with him. If he was innocent, then the watcher is still out there somewhere, elderly now, watching perhaps from a different vantage point, aware that they got away with it completely and permanently. The current owners of 657 Boulevard have declined to discuss the house's history publicly. They bought it, knowing what it was, and they have chosen to live in it anyway, which is either an act of considerable courage or a straightforward real estate calculation that a discounted price on a 6-bedroom colonial in Westfield, New Jersey, outweighed the psychological weight of its history. Perhaps both. People make peace with difficult histories all the time when the alternative is less appealing. Every old house has its stories. Most of them are simply never written down and sent to the new owners in a handwritten letter, signed with a name that was never explained. The case of the watcher at 657 Boulevard is ultimately a case about the specific vulnerability that comes with wanting something badly enough. The Broaddus family wanted that house. They had worked for it and saved for it and chosen it with care and moved toward it with the particular excitement of people who believe they have finally found the thing they were looking for. That wanting made them vulnerable in a way that is deeply human and deeply recognizable. Most of us have wanted something that badly at some point: a home, a relationship, a version of our lives that felt complete and right and earned. The Watcher understood that vulnerability and used it. Whatever the motivation behind those three letters, obsession, strategy, grievance, or something stranger and harder to name, the effect was to take the thing the Broaddus family wanted most and make it impossible. Not by destroying it physically, not by taking it away, by contaminating it, by making the wanting itself feel dangerous, by ensuring that every time Derek or Maria Broaddus thought about 657 Boulevard, they would think not about the wraparound porch or the high ceilings or the 6 bedrooms or the tree-lined street, but about the letter in the mailbox and the handwriting and the name at the bottom. The Watcher. There is no resolution to offer here. No arrest, no confession. No moment of clarity where the pieces came together and the truth emerged. Just a house on a quiet street in New Jersey. A family that tried to make it their home and could not, and 3 letters that were read by police, and investigators and attorneys and journalists, and eventually by tens of millions of people around the world, none of whom could say with certainty who wrote them or why. The watching continues. Whether you are being watched right now is not something anyone can tell you, but somewhere in Westfield, New Jersey, on a tree-lined street in a prosperous suburb 45 minutes from Manhattan, a 6-bedroom colonial house sits quietly in the afternoon light, and someone, somewhere, knows exactly what happened there. They have always known, and they are not telling. To fully understand the Watcher case, you need to understand Westfield itself, not as a backdrop or a setting, but as an active element of the story. Because what happened at 657 Boulevard did not happen in a vacuum. It happened in a very specific kind of American place, and that place shaped everything about how the case unfolded, how the community responded, and why the investigation produced the results it did. Westfield is the kind of town that American suburbs aspire to be. It has a main street with independent shops and restaurants. It has excellent public schools. It has low crime rates and high property values, and the kind of civic pride that manifests in well-maintained public spaces and active community organizations. It is the kind of place where people move deliberately, having made a considered decision that this is where they want to raise their children and build their lives. The people who live in Westfield are not there by accident. They chose it. They worked for it. They paid for it in the specific way that $1.3 million homes require you to pay for things. This matters because it means that the community of Westfield had an enormous amount invested in the idea of Westfield as a safe and desirable place. The Watcher case was not just a threat to the Broaddus family. It was a threat to the collective self-image of an entire community of people who had made significant life decisions based on the premise that places like Westfield were insulated from exactly this kind of thing. The anxiety that the case produced in the wider community was therefore not purely sympathetic concern for the Broaddus family. It was also self-interested. If this could happen to them at that address, on that street, in this town, then the safety that everyone else on every other street in Westfield had paid so much to access was not as guaranteed as they had believed. That anxiety expressed itself in complicated ways. Some residents rallied around the Broaddus family with genuine warmth and practical support. Others maintained a careful distance, as though proximity to the family's misfortune might somehow be contagious. Others still became invested in the investigation in ways that were less about justice and more about resolving their own discomfort. The need to identify the Watcher, not just to protect the Broaddus family, but to restore the community's sense of its own safety by locating the threat outside themselves. The focus on Michael Langford as the primary suspect served this psychological function, whether or not he was actually guilty. Identifying a specific person as the Watcher meant that the threat was bounded and knowable. It meant that the community could say the problem was one individual, not something systemic or diffuse or impossible to pin down. It meant that once that individual was identified and dealt with, Westfield could return to being what it had always believed itself to be. The alternative, that the watcher was unknown and might be anyone, might be a long-term respected member of the community, might be someone whose lawn was perfectly maintained and whose children went to the same schools and whose face appeared at neighborhood association meetings, was a possibility that the community found genuinely intolerable and therefore genuinely difficult to sit with. For any length of time, law enforcement faced their own institutional pressures in handling the case. The Westfield Police Department was not a large agency accustomed to high-profile investigations of this kind. The case attracted attention from state-level investigators and eventually from federal authorities who reviewed the letters for potential federal charges. But the core investigation remained at the local level, where resources and expertise in this specific type of case were limited. The pressure to produce results was significant. The pressure to be seen to produce results was perhaps even more significant given the public and eventually media attention the case attracted. The investigation's failure to produce an arrest or a charge was not for want of effort or intent. The investigators who worked the Watcher case were, by all accounts, diligent and committed. They pursued every lead that was available to them. They interviewed dozens of people. They submitted evidence to multiple laboratories. They consulted with profilers and handwriting experts and forensic linguists who analyzed the letters for clues about their author's background, education, age, and psychological profile. What they got back from all of this was a profile of someone intelligent, controlled, locally rooted, with a genuine long-term connection to the neighborhood, and with enough awareness of the legal system to calibrate their communications carefully. That profile described a significant number of people in Westfield and its surrounding area, and without physical evidence connecting any specific individual to the letters, it was not enough to move forward. The forensic linguistics analysis of the letters deserves particular attention because it produced some of the most interesting and most overlooked findings in the entire investigation. Forensic linguistics is the study of language as evidence, the analysis of word choice, sentence structure, idiom, and rhetorical patterns to draw conclusions about a writer's background, education, age, regional origin, and in some cases, identity. The analysts who examined the Watcher letters noted several consistent features that pointed toward a specific type of writer. The letters showed a sophisticated understanding of rhetorical effect. The writer knew how to build tension, how to deploy specific images for maximum psychological impact, and how to calibrate the level of explicit threat to stay just below the legal threshold while remaining clearly menacing. This was not the writing of someone with limited education or limited verbal facility. This was someone who had either a natural gift for language or a developed familiarity with written communication as a tool of persuasion and intimidation. The references to the 1920s and the 1960s were particularly interesting to the analysts. They were either genuine family history, which would significantly narrow the pool of potential suspects to people with multi-generational connections to the Boulevard area, or they were invented for effect, which would suggest a writer sophisticated enough to understand that a claim of long historical connection would be more frightening than a simple statement of current obsession. Either way, the references served the letter's psychological purpose perfectly, and their presence pointed to a writer who was thinking carefully about the effect of every word they put on the page. The word choice throughout the letters was notably consistent with someone of middle age or older, with an education level above average and a familiarity with formal written English that suggested someone who had spent significant time reading and writing as part of their professional or personal life. The tone was that of someone accustomed to authority, not the authority of physical intimidation, but the authority of someone who expected to be taken seriously and was confident that their words would have the intended effect. None of this was sufficient to identify the Watcher, but it built a picture that was consistent with what the broader investigation had established. Someone local, someone educated, someone with a long connection to the area, someone who had thought carefully about what they were doing and why, and someone who had managed, despite everything, to leave no traceable evidence behind. The question of motivation is the one that the investigation was ultimately least able to answer. Every theory about who the Watcher was implied a different motivation, and the motivation was the key to understanding whether the letters were the work of a genuine obsessive who believed what they wrote about the house and its hunger and its history, or a calculated actor using the language of obsession as a strategic tool, or something in between, someone whose genuine psychological investment in 657 Boulevard had taken a form that was both real and instrumental at the same time. The obsessive theory holds that the Watcher genuinely believed the house had a special significance, genuinely felt a family duty to watch over it, and genuinely experienced the Broaddus family's arrival as an intrusion into something sacred and personal. This theory is consistent with the content of the letters, which read as the sincere expression of a worldview rather than as a performance of one. It is also consistent with the persistence of the correspondence. 3 letters over several months suggests sustained engagement rather than a single impulsive act. The strategic theory holds that the Watcher had a specific goal: driving the Broaddus family out, reducing the value of the property, settling a grievance, winning some kind of advantage, and used the language of obsession deliberately because it was the most effective available tool for achieving that goal without crossing into clearly prosecutable territory. This theory is consistent with the legal calibration of the letters and with the timing of their arrival immediately after the sale completed. The truth may be that these theories are not mutually exclusive. People are capable of genuine psychological investment in outcomes that also serve their practical interests. The Watcher may have both believed what they wrote and understood that writing it served a purpose beyond simple expression. The house may have genuinely meant something to whoever sent those letters, and the desire to reclaim it or protect it or punish the people who had bought it may have been simultaneously sincere and strategic. That combination, genuine feeling weaponized with strategic intelligence. There is a category of cases in American criminal and civil history that sit alongside the Watcher case in uncomfortable proximity. Cases where anonymous communications were used to terrorize individuals or families, where the perpetrator was never definitively identified, and where the psychological damage inflicted far exceeded anything that a conventional crime of equivalent legal severity would typically produce. The Watcher case belongs to this category, and understanding it in that context reveals something important about why it continues to hold such a powerful place in the public imagination a decade after the first letter arrived. Anonymous, threatening communications have a long history in America and elsewhere. The specific terror they produce comes from a combination of factors that conventional crimes do not typically generate simultaneously. There is the violation of privacy, the knowledge that someone has been watching closely enough to know your address, your family composition, your movements, and your vulnerabilities. There is the asymmetry of information. The sender knows who they are, and you do not, which means they hold all the power in the interaction, and you hold none. There is the sustained uncertainty, unlike a physical crime that happens and ends. Anonymous threatening communications create a state of ongoing threat that has no natural terminus. You do not know when the next letter will arrive. You do not know when the watching will stop. You do not know if the watching has ever stopped. And there is the specific horror of being chosen, of knowing that out of all the people in all the houses on all the streets in all the towns in the country, someone has decided that you are the object of their attention, and you cannot make them stop because you cannot find them. The Broaddus family experienced all of these simultaneously and sustained. Their case was in some ways the perfect expression of this category of harm, maximally frightening, minimally actionable, and permanent in its psychological effects in a way that the eventual sale of the house and the passage of time could diminish but not erase. Cases with structural similarities to the Watcher have occurred throughout American history, though few have achieved the same level of public attention. In the 1990s, a family in suburban Connecticut received a series of anonymous letters over several years that described their daily routines in detail, referenced their children by name, and made vague but persistent references to harm that might come to them if they did not leave their home. The letters stopped abruptly after 3 years and were never attributed to any individual. The family sold their home and moved, but the case was never solved, and the perpetrator was never identified. It was covered locally and then forgotten. Because in the 1990s, the mechanisms for a story like that to reach a national audience did not yet exist in the way they do today. In the 2000s, a similar case occurred in a suburb of Chicago, where a family received anonymous letters that combined real estate grievances with language that echoed the Watcher letters in its references to the house having a history and a purpose that the current occupants were failing to honor. That case also went unsolved. The family also eventually moved. The letters also stopped. Whether the stopping was because the goal had been achieved or because circumstances changed for the writer or for some other reason entirely is unknown. These cases share with the Watcher case a frustrating characteristic that defines this entire category of crime. The perpetrator's success depends entirely on their invisibility. The moment they are identified, the power dynamic shifts completely. A known harasser can be restrained, charged, and prosecuted. An unknown one cannot be stopped by any conventional means because there is nothing to stop. The invisibility is not incidental to the crime. It is the crime. The watching only works as a weapon because the watched cannot see who is watching. The Watcher understood this perfectly. 3 letters over several months and then silence. Enough to destroy a family's relationship with their home, generate years of investigation, and produce a level of public fascination that continues a decade. Later, not enough to be caught. The economy of it is almost admirable in a deeply disturbing way. 3 letters. That was all it took. 3 letters and a name and a claim of generational watching that may or may not have been true. And it did not matter whether it was true because the effect was the same either way. 657. Boulevard was a 6-bedroom colonial house in a prosperous New Jersey suburb. It had good bones and high ceilings and a wraparound porch and everything a family could want. It had been standing since 1905 and had housed multiple families without incident across more than a century of American life. The Broaddus family were not the first people to fall in love with it, and they will not be the last. Houses like that endure. They outlast the people who live in them and the stories that attach to them and the fears that make them temporarily impossible to inhabit. But the story of what happened there between 2014 and 2019 will not be easily detached from 657 Boulevard, regardless of how many families live there in the decades to come. It is part of the house now in the way that certain histories become part of certain places, not physically present, not visible in the walls or the floors or the ceilings, but there nonetheless in the way that knowledge is always there once. You have it. The new owners know, the neighbors know, anyone who searches the address knows. The house carries its story with it the way all houses carry their stories, quietly and permanently and without any way of putting it down. Somewhere a person who called themselves the Watcher made a decision to send 3 letters to a family they may never have met about a house they may or may not have had any genuine connection to, using language designed to cause maximum fear with minimum legal consequence. That person has lived with that decision for a decade. They have watched the case become national news. They have watched it become a Netflix series. They have watched the Broaddus family tell their story to journalists and courts and eventually to a global audience of streaming subscribers. They have watched all of this from wherever they are, knowing what they know, and they have said nothing. The patience required for that is extraordinary. The Watcher claimed generational patience as a defining characteristic. Grandfather in the 20s, father in the 60s, themselves in the present, watching and waiting across decades for the right family to arrive. Whether that claim was true or invented, the patience it described turned out to be genuine in at least one respect. Whoever wrote those letters has waited out a decade of investigation, media scrutiny, public fascination, and Netflix dramatization without breaking, without telling anyone, without the guilt or the pride or the simple human need to be known, producing a confession or a slip or a moment of legible visibility. They are still watching. From somewhere, they cannot be identified and will not identify themselves. They are still watching, and the house at 657 Boulevard is still standing on its quiet, tree-lined street in Westfield, New Jersey. Its current occupants going about their lives in its high-ceilinged rooms. Its wraparound porch catching the afternoon light the way it always has. Its bones as good as they ever were. Some things do not resolve. Some questions do not get answers. Some watchers are never found. This is one of them, and if you have ever stood at a window and looked out at a quiet street and felt, for just a moment, the particular discomfort of not knowing whether someone out there was looking back. Now you know what that feeling has a name.